Okay, so welcome to today's Pearl of Computation talk. Today I'm going to try and describe the work of Tony Hoare, who's one of the recipients of the Turing Award, which is sort of the ultimate accolade for a computer scientist. But as you will see straight away, Tony Hoare did not just get the Turing Award. This is just a selection of the awards and honors that he has received during his career. And in fact, you will see that the Turing Award is the first one, actually, in temporal order. He got it in 1980. He was knighted, so he's actually Sir Charles Anthony Richard Hoare, best known as Tony Hoare, in 2000. And in the year 2000, he also got the Kyoto Prize. Now, the Kyoto Prize is a major Japanese prize. It's kind of a Japanese Nobel Prize. He got it for information technology. There are, like in the Nobel Prize, there are several versions of this prize for various academic disciplines. He got the ACM Programming Languages Award from SIGPLAN, the IEEE John von Neumann Medal, and as you will see during the talk, he also got some other awards, which I will mention later on. So let me start by giving you a little trivia quiz. What do you think Tony Hoare got his Turing Award for? Okay, so the Magnus here is saying for CSP. That's a good shot. So he got it for fundamental contributions to the definition and design of programming languages. Now, actually, probably most of you know Tony Hoare for Quicksort, but not for his contribution to the design of programming languages. In fact, I think that our students probably only will ever hear about Tony Hoare during their degree course for the thing that he's not honored for, in a way. Now, in what field was Hoare's bachelor degree? And did he ever get a PhD? Okay, some people are saying mathematics. The answer will be revealed later on during the talk. So I don't expect you to know the answers to these questions right now, but you will certainly, I hope, you will know the answer to these questions at the end of the talk. Also, Hoare is well known for being very good at acknowledging what he thinks are his major mistakes. In particular, one of them he calls his billion-dollar mistake, and I will tell you what that is. Now, today, Tony Hoare is 80. What does he do now? Okay, I guess the obvious answer is he's retired and enjoying life, which is true, but in fact, he's very much scientifically active. In 2006, when he was already retired, he started an interview by saying sort of, well, when he was asked to introduce himself, he said, I'm Tony Hoare, I'm a principal researcher at Microsoft Research, Cambridge, UK. That's what he is today at age 80. So he's still very much active and alive. Now, I will introduce the achievements of Tony Hoare, some of his achievements, not all of them, by sort of putting them in the context of his life. So at the same time, I'll try to give you a rundown of his achievements and mention some of the events in his actual life, because some of them were actually quite interesting and had something to do with the work that he eventually did. Now, Tony Hoare was very much, is very much, a son of the British Empire. In fact, he was born in Ceylon, which is today Sri Lanka, in 1934. Well, I've already told you that he's 80, so you could have guessed his birthday. And he went to school in Sri Lanka up to the age of 11. And he still recounts of sort of going to school and meeting elephants and tigers along the way. So that's quite a fascinating thing to have. His father was a civil servant. He was a civil servant of the British Empire, and his mother was the daughter of a tea planter. So cannot be more British than that. When he returned to the UK, he attended King's School in Canterbury in Kent and started developing an interest in philosophy. Already then, he was very studious, and people at school called him the professor. In fact, probably already in Ceylon, in Sri Lanka, they called him the professor, which was quite portentous of things to come. His interest in philosophy led him to study classics and philosophy. So his bachelor degree is in classics and philosophy at the University of Oxford, where he attended Merton College, which was the same college that his father attended. Now, this was pretty much the done thing at the time. If you were from Oxbridge, you would try to follow on the footsteps of your parents. And also, this might make it easier for you to get a place in some of these colleges and to enter Oxford or Cambridge. And he finished his degrees in 1956 at age 22. Now, these studies were quite interesting. This is a quotation by him. I will pepper the talk with quotations from Tony Hoare, so I don't want to invent anything. I just quote the source's mouth. So in this course, he learned about ancient Latin, ancient Greek, language and literature, classical history, and philosophy. And it was modern philosophy that interested him the most. In fact, during his studies, one of these assignments the assignment that he got was to write an essay about Turing's paper on Turing machines and undecidability from 1936, which I would say is pretty enlightened, actually, for a degree course in classics and philosophy. So he was really considering, and he recounts the story of when he was reading this paper, and he missed lunch because he was so excited about this. But at the time for him, I mean, sort of computing and the computing devices, the computer, which really didn't exist very much at that time, was interesting as a philosophical possibility. And Turing himself actually was very much a philosopher as well as a scientist, thinking about issues like, can machines think? And in fact, this interest in philosophy should not be too surprising, and the connection between philosophy and computing, because computer science is really the ultimate embodiment of the logicist approach to philosophy. And mathematical logic forms, as of today, as we speak, really the formal basis, the foundations for the formal basis of programming languages. The syntax, the semantics, the types that you see in programming languages today, they are really the formal embodiment of a dream of many logicians in the past, starting from Aristotle to today. Now, what next? Well, you know, in a British college, you meet a lot of interesting people and you form bonds that sometimes last for lifetimes. According to Tony Hoare, one of his early influence was a guy by the name of Michael Jackson, not the moonwalking guy, but a pioneer of actual formal treatment and formal methods. One of the sons of Michael Jackson is a guy by the name of Daniel Jackson, who's a professor at MIT today as we speak, and is the developer of a language called Alloy and the tool set of Alloy for the formal specification of languages. So Michael Jackson interested Tony Hoare in computing more and more, and Tony Hoare got Michael Jackson interested in using mathematical logic to describe the meaning of programs and to describe things. In fact, one of the nice quotations from Michael Jackson is, in computer science, description is our business. And how do we describe things? By means of languages. And languages is one of the things that logic is about. Now, already in 1958, Hoare attended a programming course. Remember, he's still sort of a fresh graduate from a philosophy, well, from a classics course. He's the kind of guy that today we will not admit to our degree courses in Reykjavik University because he probably didn't have that many ECTS of credits or that many units of mathematics. Well, perhaps that would be a mistake. So he took this course in a programming language called Mercury Autocode. Never heard of it before? Well, neither did I when I learned that. Now, as part of this programming course, he chose his own exercise. And what do you do? Well, he chose to program the solution to a two-person game using techniques developed by von Neumann and Morgenstern. So he chose game theory as his own programming exercise, which was pretty ambitious, I would say, for somebody who never programmed before. Well, if asked, did your program work? He said, well, it did, I think. Well, actually, I don't know whether it worked or not, because I forgot to put assertions into the program, and by the end, it certainly terminated, it ran to completion, but the calculations that it carried out were far too too complicated for me to reproduce them by hand. So I could never be sure whether with numerical outputs that were calculated by my program were correct. This perhaps sparked this interest later on in the interest of in using assertions to actually check whether your program does the right thing, and a lifelong interest in putting programming on a firm basis. Now, what do you do if you are a Briton at that age? Well, at that time, national service was compulsory, so he did national service in the Royal Navy, where he learned military Russian. In the words of Hoare, he could name every piece of a ship in Russian, but he didn't know what these pieces actually were. So when he returned from the army, he actually enrolled on some degree courses in statistics, and he took the opportunity of getting a British Council scholarship to go to Russia. Now, it's not like going to Russia today. This was 1960. In 1960, Russia was the enemy. You know, Cold War, you're too young for this, but remember, 1960 is only 15 years after the end of the Second World War, and we are at the height of the Cold War. According to sort of Hoare's words, those were very exciting times, in more ways than one. Historically, those were the times when Khrushchev and Eisenhower were sort of perhaps thawing the Cold War a little bit. Well, until in 1960, an American spy plane was shot over Russia, and that immediately froze the Cold War even more than it did before. So according to Tony Hoare, the Russians were really, really friendly. But you can never introduce one of your Russian friends to another Russian friends, because each one of them would think that the other one was an informant of the KGB. So you never do that. And when you were in your rooms, you were sure that your rooms were bugged, so you could never talk about your Russian friends. So this was pretty complicated. Well, on the scientific side, things were also very exciting. He was working under the direction of Andrey Kolmogorov. Now, for those of you who don't know, Kolmogorov is one of the greatest mathematicians of the 20th century by any measure of greatness. He's also very strongly connected to computer science because he introduced Kolmogorov complexity and other, so he was one of the fathers of modern probability theory, but he was also interested in machine translation. So he actually got Hoare to work on machine translation, translating automatically from Russian to English. Now, Google Translate did not exist at that time. Statistical methods of translations did not exist. Things were very mechanical. So what is it that you had? You had a dictionary that told you what was the English version of each Russian version, and this was stored on magnetic tape. And if you read the magnetic tape, now you're too young for that, but the magnetic tape is like reading a cassette, which you've probably never played in your own life, but anyway, it doesn't really matter. It takes a long time. It takes 45 minutes to play a cassette from beginning to the end, and even rewinding takes time. So Hoare thought, okay, the dictionary is organized in alphabetical order. I could perhaps sort the words in my Russian or whatever English text so that I only need to make one pass to the magnetic tape. So he was led to think about sorting in 1960. And the first thing he thought about was bubble sort, what today is non-bubble sort. But he realized it was too slow. So his second guess at a good sorting algorithm was Quicksort. Quicksort was born 1960. He published it in 1961. And in his own words, that's the only interesting algorithm I ever developed. And actually, I thought it was only an exercise, an interesting exercise in programming. You don't need to beat the bush if you're if you're Hoare. So what next? Well, when he was in Moscow, actually, there was a fair in which British industries were presenting their work to the Russian market, which is kind of interesting because those were the days of the Cold War. Today, we have all kinds of things. Oh, thou shalt never sell your secrets to anyone who is perhaps an enemy of yours. And one of these companies was a company called Elliott Brothers that was a small, in his own words, computer manufacturer. The computing division employed about 1,000 people. So Hoare was hired, and actually they gave him 100 pounds more in his salary because he could speak Russian. So what is it that they did? Well, at that time, they were developing a new, faster version of their flagship computer, and to celebrate this new computer, they wanted to develop a new programming language, not Mercury autocode, a new programming language to program the machines. Well, Hoare, at that time, was reading through the report on the algorithmic language Algol 60 and managed to convince the company that instead of him sort of developing a new language from scratch, they should actually implement Algol. He managed to convince the company to do that, and his first job was, one of his first jobs there, was to write an Algol 60 compiler. Now, for those of you who don't know, Algol 60 is really the mother of all modern programming languages. Forget about Fortran. It was the first ever language that has a formally defined syntax in BNF. And the semantics was given in natural language, but it was very, very precise. Now, actually, the work on this compiler was very momentous because his wife, his would-be wife, was actually working on the compiler. So it was compiler at first sight, we might say that. He also worked on operating system, but the company actually scrapped that work, throwing away about 30 man-years of programming effort. Yak. Now, just to give you the idea, I mean, today you get courses, semester courses on compiler design. This was the state of the art at that time. Nobody really knew whether you could actually write the compiler. You would just start, try, and see what happens. And there was no community really to which you could refer. If you had some problem, there was no community to refer to just to figure out if somebody else had solved it. You just did it yourself, and perhaps many different teams were solving the same problem at the same time. So quite different from today, where you go to Stack Exchange or Math Overflow or whatever, and you ask questions. Now, already then, around that time, when he was working in industry, Hoare became quite famous in the programming language community because he contributed to the development of Algol 60 and then to its follow-up, which was called Algol W. You're probably not interested in that, but that was the language I was taught in my first programming course. It's sort of a follow-up of Algol, which included the first object-oriented features. And Tony Hoare was set to work by Niklas Wirth, and together with Niklas Wirth, who's the father of Pascal, that was a successor of Algol W, they started developing a type system for this language. First ever sort of object-oriented language. As part of this work, he decided to invent the null pointer, which in his own words is his billion-dollar mistake. It has caused billions of dollars of pain and damage in the last 40 years, and there is a nice talk where he basically talks for an hour about why that was a bad idea. So every time you use a null pointer, just think about Tony Hoare. In fact, in his talk, he goes as far as saying that in his experience, the designer of a language should be held responsible for the mistakes programmers make when using it. Now, what does he mean by that? Okay, if this was the case, then nobody would ever design a language. They would be too dangerous. Well, what he means is that as a designer of a language, you should take responsibility for whatever junk you put in your language. You should actually think long and hard about every type of construct you put in your language. If you yourself cannot give a reasonable meaning to the constructs, don't put them there. They're going to cause pain. And in fact, sort of null pointers actually cause pain at runtime for many people. You should do as much static analysis as possible. Now, what next? Well, he was working in industry at Elliott Brothers, but Elliott Brothers was a relatively small company that then was eaten up by a larger company, which was eaten up by a larger company, and somehow the work in industry was becoming less and less interesting for him. So he thought, perhaps it's time to go back to academia. Well, he didn't really plan it that well or that much. He saw an advertisement in a newspaper for an academic position at the Queen's University in Belfast with deadline the day after. So he said, okay, I write a letter of application. If I make the Evening Post, which is another very British thing of that time. The post would be collected several times during the year, during the day from your post box. I'll post it, otherwise I won't. He posted it, he got the job. Now, one of the very first contributions he made when he went back to academia was to develop something which we don't teach to our undergraduates, and we should. It's something called Hoare logic. Whenever I say this, undergraduates actually tend to laugh quite a bit, especially when I talk about Hoare triples, but there you are. What was the motivation for inventing Hoare logic? Well, Algol 60, as I already told you, had a very, very formally defined syntax, but the semantics was written in natural language. Now, Hoare himself says it was written very well by Peter Now, who's also another Turing Award winner from Denmark, but it was informal. So his goal was to get an equally good formalization of the semantics of the language, or in fact, any kind of programming language. However, he had a dream. And what was the dream? The dream is the following. The formal specification should not overly constrain the implementers of the language. That is to say, it should only say what is the background information that any programmer writing programs in that language would need to know in order to write correct programs. It should not actually specify how the language is implemented. Exactly. The implementer should have some freedom in achieving the requirements of the formal semantics of the language in order to make the implementation as efficient as they possibly can. So what is a good idea? What is a good language for giving such specifications? Well, think back. Hoare was in love with logic. And logic is really the ultimate description language that you have. Whenever you write a formula in a logic, you just describe what is it that you want, but now how it should be implemented. So it's natural, since he was looking, to an approach for the specification of the semantics of a language that would give as much freedom as possible to an implementer to implement the language, that he would choose logic in terms of a set of axioms to describe properties of an implementation without describing how the implementation works. And this is really what Hoare logic is all about. He wrote a paper which has become a classic in 1969. It has over 5,000, well, nearly 6,000 citations. So this is the only formal part that is in my presentation, but I needed to have at least a little bit of formality. So here's how a Hoare logic specification, what a Hoare logic specification looks like. So you have a so-called Hoare triple, which consists of two assertions, P and Q. P is called the precondition, Q is called the postcondition, and S is a program. How do we read that thing? That thing actually is read as follows. If you start executing the program S from a system state that satisfies the precondition, then if and when, this is called partial correctness, but anyway, so if and when the computation terminates, it will do so in a state that satisfies the postcondition. So this only describes the behavior of this program S at the interfaces. It tells you if you feed the program S with inputs that satisfy the precondition, then the program S guarantees that the output, or that whatever it leaves behind, satisfies the postcondition. That's a really influential idea. You don't describe the behavior of the implementation, you describe its behavior at the interface, so the actual how it works, but what it does. And in order to establish formally this type of assertion, Hoare proposes a system of inference rules, because this is just the logic, and the system of inference rules was then shown to be as good as you need by Stephen Cook, another Turing Award winner who got the Turing Award for introducing the concept of NP completeness and proving that satisfiability is NP complete. Now, you find these ideas everywhere today. So, object-oriented analysis and design, when you actually specify the behavior of, say, methods, you write requires effects clauses. What are those? Well, pre- and post-condition specification of what the method does. Design by contract. Have you ever heard this term? well, suppose I want to use your methods in my programs. What is it that I need to know about your methods? Do I need to know how you implemented them? No, all I need to know is what they do, what kind of inputs they expect, and what they do on the legal limits. What is that? It's a contract between you and me. You give me something that obeys the precondition, postcondition specification that requires a text clause. Well, I can use it. You promise that your implementation does that. I take it off the shelf and I use it. You don't want to go to the library and go through every line of code to understand what the library does. You just need to know what its input-output description is. And languages like Eiffel, which probably many of you have never heard of, developed by Bertrand Meyer at ETH, actually takes these very seriously. Pre- and post-condition, loop invariants, they are part of programs. Now, Hoare is very honest with himself. He said, I thought this idea would catch on. Well, the message of this quote is it didn't. Why? Well, because language designers do not want to obey their contracts, I guess. What did he do next? Well, for people like me, one of the buzzwords when I was a student was structured programming. What does it mean? For some people, this means death to go-tos. Thou shalt never have things like go-tos. But there's more to it. In fact, Hoare contributed to the development of structured programming, and the classic textbook or the classic book on this topic is still this book from 1972, so slightly over 40 years old, with contributions by, guess who? Dijkstra on structured programming, Hoare on data structuring, and Dahl and Hoare on hierarchical program structures. Now, Dahl is a Norwegian guy who's one of the fathers of Simula, the original object-oriented language. Now, what do all these authors have in common? They are all Turing Award winners, apart from being all European. So they are some of the European Turing Award winners. Now, in Hoare's contribution to this book, which is still read and should be read by programmers, Hoare actually worked on try to carry the message that in order to write good programs, you need abstraction. You need high-level languages. You need abstract data types. But when you have abstract data types, you need to implement them using concrete data types. And then you have to ask yourself, well, what is the connection between the specification of the abstract operation and what the machine is actually doing? And he raised the issue of data correctness, and he proposed methods based, for instance, on simulation for proving that actually your implementation is a correct implementation of your abstract data type operations. But remember these keywords, abstraction and high-level languages. Why? Because he applied them to probably one of the most concrete things that you could imagine a computer scientist would do, namely operating systems, writing operating systems. Remember, he had been involved in writing an operating system for Elliott Brothers, which was then thrown away with 30 man-years of work. Perhaps that experience made him wiser, so he introduced a high-level concept, abstraction mechanism, to be used in the writing of operating systems, and that's monitors. I hope you will see monitors in the operating systems course for the students in the room, for the bachelor students in the room. If you don't, then go back and read this paper. But basically, the idea, a monitor, is nothing but something that today we would call a class. And this class abstracts the behavior of a scheduler that manages access to a given resource. Hoare showed that monitors are equivalent in power to semaphores, but semaphores are low-level things, monitors are high-level abstract entities. When I was a student, I had to learn in my operating system course a language called concurrent Pascal, developed by Per Brinchansen, another Dane, even though he was working in the United States at that time. This whole concurrent version of Pascal was based very firmly on the notion of monitor and was used to write an operating system called Solo. Now, if I was not on YouTube, I will tell you the rather infamous story of my examination in operating systems, but I will tell you later on when we are off the air. It has a lot to do with concurrent Pascals and monitors. I'm not particularly proud of that. Okay, so next, what next? Well, monitors were abstract things, but monitors, they were still dealing with shared memory. A monitor somehow is some kind of encapsulation of a notion which is perhaps even more primitive than that. And that's the notion of process. Like the processes that you sort of spawn all the time today when you're working on your computer. One of the red threads in Hoare's work is the inspiration that he draws from current technology. So at that time, people started developing the first microprocessors. And Hoare, thinking about it, thought that it was very easy to predict that the cheapest and fastest way of building computing devices would be to put together a vast collection of microprocessors and make them communicate via wires. Note, communicate. Of course, shared variables are a form of communication, but they are a pretty low-level form of communication. I don't send you a message, I just do something to a variable, and then where you're interested in getting something from me, you go and read that variable, or you mess around with that. And you know, that creates all kinds of things, races, how do you know that sort of atomic operations, things are still the curse of shared memory computing today. So these are problems that we still, in many ways, don't know how to solve effectively to write reliable programs. So what Hoare did was to take the concept of communication seriously. He imagined a programming model in which you would write processes that have their own store, but that they achieve synchronization and communication of information by doing exactly that, communicating on the wires, and these processes could be the microprocessors that I was talking about, communicating on the wires by sending messages and receiving messages one from the other. So what he says is that, well, this seems to herald a new discipline of computing, and perhaps in order to make full use of this new discipline of computing, you would need a new language for a new programming paradigm for this type of systems. And this is the birth of communicating sequential processes. This is what Magnus was mentioning right at the beginning. The original article in Communication of the ACM in this 1985 book, which appeared in a series that Tony Hoare himself was editor for Prentice Hall, have received over 18,000 citations. Not too bad. So what do you do? Well, Hoare, before introducing the language of communicating sequential processes, had moved from Queen's University in Belfast to Oxford University Programming Laboratory. Now, if you are a British academic, Oxford, especially if you're educated in Oxford or Cambridge, having a position at Oxford or Cambridge is the thing to do. And he did that, I think in 1977. That's when he moved. Now, this was a time where a very influential British computer scientist had just passed away. And this is a guy by the name of Christopher Strachey. Now, for people who know about denotational semantics, Christopher Strachey and Dana Scott, who was then a professor at Oxford himself, they are the guys who really pushed for the development of denotational semantics. But what is interesting for our story was that sort of Hoare actually became, well, literally took Strachey's office and Strachey's chair of computer science. He was sitting in his office, in his chair. And one day, he just opened the drawer and he found a memo of Christopher Strachey where he said the following thing. Theory for the sake of theory can usually become sterile, but practice that is not informed by theory easily becomes adult. If you are not able to firmly base one on the other, you're going to get in trouble, both on the theoretical side and on the practical side. You cannot develop good computing systems without an appropriate theory. Well, Hoare took this to heart, And he started at least two famous collaborations with industry. One of them with IBM, where he pushed the use of a specification language developed by Abrial in France. And this specification language is called Z. It's based on set theory. And they used it to describe and analyze one of the most profitable pieces of software that IBM was developing at the time. For this, they got a Queen's Technology Award. So it's tech transfer, 1977 or thereabouts. Okay. But it didn't stop there. You know, remember these microprocessors communicating with one another? At that time, or soon after that time, there was a high-tech British hardware manufacturer by the name of Inmos that was developing a very, very advanced type of microprocessor, which is still called the transputer. Now, the transputer was, I think, the first ever microprocessor that had a floating point unit, for instance, built into it. So Inmos, together with the Oxford Computing Laboratory, started collaborating on a language for programming the transputer, and this language was based on the idea of communicating sequential processes and goes under the name of OCaml. Moreover, they were interested in figuring out whether the implementation of the floating point unit that they had was actually according to the IEEE standard. Hoare and his collaborator, in particular Roscoe, who was one of the PhD students of Tony Hoare, who was already a professor at that time, and one of his PhD students, Barrett, they formally analyzed the design of the floating point unit in the transputer. They find at least one significant bug. They found another bug that the engineers claimed they knew about. But anyway, sort of the result was so good that once the bug that Barrett and Roscoe found was corrected, Inmos didn't do any testing whatsoever. They just produced the floating point unit, and it worked like a charm. And Inmos went on record as saying that this saved them loads of pounds and at least 1 year of work. They got a Queen's Award for technology transfer also for this activity. So you can see sort of, these are two examples of successful technology transfer using cutting-edge research in cutting-edge industrial applications. Well, sort of, what did he do after that? Well, he did several other things. So he developed a specification language called the duration calculus for specifying real-time systems together with Zhu Xiaocheng and Anders Raun, who was a colleague of Anna's and mine at Aalborg. He pushed very much for the use of algebras to express laws of programming. Now, algebra is a very compact specification language. If you can write down a nice equation that you can understand, and the equation is not thousands of lines long, that's a very, very concise specification language. So, for instance, in the world of programming languages, a law of programming could be sequential composition, semicolon is associative. So it really doesn't matter whether you do A and then B followed by C, or A followed by B and then C. Well, it's just A, then B, then C. That's why in your programming languages, you don't put parentheses everywhere around semicolons, because they are not necessary, because the thing is actually associative. Another thing that he's been interested in, basically from then onwards to today, is unifying theories of programming. He basically says, okay, you look at programming today, there are all kinds of programming paradigms, all kinds of theories to explain what the programs in different styles of programming actually do. What we need sometimes is to step back and see what are the commonalities. Sometimes you really want to use tools from different strands of research, but you don't know actually whether they can work together, whether they are consistent with one another. And the unifying theory, like a theory of everything in physics, can actually help. Of course, we are a long way from a theory of everything in physics, perhaps, and we are a long way from a theory of everything in programming, but this doesn't mean we shouldn't try. Now, what do you do when you retire? Well, of course, you take up a position in Microsoft Research, and that's what he's been doing since 1999. So what is it that it's been trying to do? Remember, he was running away from shared memory concurrency. And in his own words, one of the reasons why he was running away from it was that because he felt that he couldn't actually understand what was going on. These type of programs were far too difficult for me. I could see no real prospect of working out the theory that would help people to write correct programs to exploit shared memory concurrency. However, today, within the multi-core area, shared memory concurrency is back. It's everywhere, actually. So we do need these methods. And Hoare is actively contributing to research on that. And some of his work has been influential, for instance, in developing formalisms like separation logic, which has been developed by John Reynolds and Peter O'Hearn. And these are applied today in all kinds of scenarios. So for instance, Facebook today actually employed Peter O'Hearn to analyze their programs using tools that he has developed based on separation logic. And somehow some of these ideas can be traced back to Hoare's work. So what has Hoare done? What is the red thread throughout his career? Well, in his own words, the red thread in his career is the tenet that the computer program is a worthy topic for scientific study. And what he has been trying to do throughout his career, using the tools of logic that he has loved since he was at school, at King's, or whatever it was, King's School in Canterbury, the tools of logic, is to try and answer the following questions. Whenever you have a program, you should ask yourself, what does it do? How does it work? Why does it work? And then, in certain situations, you also have to ask yourself, okay, sort of, in order to answer the first three questions, you really need to develop a theory of programming. Because how do you describe what the program is supposed to do? Well, you have to give specifications. You need a language for describing what is expected of the program, not how that is achieved, but what is expected of the program. And perhaps this theory also needs to take into account a description of the environment in which the program runs. And in Hoare's work, this might even mean the human users who actually use the program. Well, use cases, perhaps, some idealization of the human users. How does it work? Well, this needs semantics. You need to know how the program is organized into modules, how the modules interact together, and what the semantics of the language is. Otherwise, you have no hope of understanding what the program does when it runs. Why does it work? Well, that's the ultimate question. That's program correctness. How do you know that, yes, this bunch of 1,000 subprograms that you've written, they are linked together and communicate, interact in the way that you made them interact, actually achieve the specification that you set out to achieve? But once you have the theory, you have to ask yourself, well, how do we figure out whether it actually applies to the real world of programming? And if you're successful in answering that question, which you can only do by experiments, sort of how do you transfer the result of your research on the theory of programming to engineering practice? And there he has a keyword, which is automation. Today, engineering of any discipline is automated. So it's the computers themselves that actually make the design choices at the end of the day, perhaps by optimizing lots of different parameters or trying to optimize or approximate some optimization. So thou shalt develop tools that you can then show to industry, and perhaps industry will carry on from there, enlighten the industry at least. Okay, so what does he say? If there exists such a subject as the theory of programming, then Tony Hoare says, I can perhaps be regarded as one of its founders. That's what I like to be remembered for. The future, because he's not done. At age 80, he will be 81 in January. Tony is still very much active in research. He still publishes papers. So this year he has published 4 papers according to DBLP. Okay, one of them is a short introduction to an invited talk. But anyway, he still goes to conferences. He's invited to give invited talks. like at Concur 2014. This year, he gave an invited talk to celebrate the 25th edition of that conference. He gave an invited talk at the first edition of that conference in 1990, and Anna and I were there together with some other people. Let me give you some closing thoughts on academic research. Okay, we live in a world, in an environment in which we are supposed to be very, very applied. Well, sometimes too theoretical work is shunned, and of course, theory for theory's sake is probably not what we should be doing, even though we love it. But what Hoare says is that, okay, academic research not only should look at the short term, but it should look at the pure basic, very long-term research that perhaps will never be applied. We should keep pursuing higher and longer-term ideals, because these are the crazy ideas that perhaps once in a lifetime really advance the state of the art and make breakthroughs. He says, in computer science, the most relevant scientific ideal from the point of view of programming is total correctness of computer programs, guaranteed by proof conducted with the assistance of computers. So thou shalt program computers to check that programs actually do what they're supposed to be doing. And people are working on this. We are still a long way from achieving this ideal, and we perhaps will never get there, but a lot of progress has been made. Of course, then there is real life. It's then for the engineer to decide how much to mess around for correctness in order to get the efficiency that he or she wants. But remember, a very efficient program that is wrong is wrong. It might be a very efficient wrong program, but it doesn't do what it's supposed to be doing. So efficiency for efficiency's sake is not good. Conclusion, I could not, since we have Spanish guests here, at least only one today, usually we have more, I have to mention that Tony Hoare received several honorary doctorates, and I think the last one in order of appearance is the one that we received from the Universitat Complutense in Madrid in 2012, and that's a photo from that time. So I hope that you can now answer the Tony Hoare trivia quiz question that I had before. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm on time. Any questions? Okay, Adrian and then Magnus.
So, the idea of communicating through systems, right? Are you aware of who came up with the idea, with these ideas first? I think I know of two schools of working.
So the question is, who came up with the idea of communicating processes first? Because there were at least two different schools, the Edinburgh.
Or even, like, even if it came from another field, would it come from?
Okay, so there were at least two proponents of this idea of structuring your programs by considering communication as a fundamental principle. There's Robin Milner and the Edinburgh school that followed him, and there is the CSP school. I don't want to say who came first. I think sort of in terms of date of publication, the communication of the ACM articles came first, but Milner had been working on models of communicating processes from a theoretical viewpoint in parallel. So I think this was an idea that was very much alive at the same time in the UK, in two different schools, in Edinburgh and in Oxford, and somehow sort of the fact that two luminaries of computer science actually came up with the same idea at roughly the same time means that that was an idea that was very much in the air if you really started thinking about how to structure concurrent parallel processes. And I think this is, I really don't know. I don't think either of them came first. Magnus.
I was going to ask about Milner versus Hoare.
Okay, Magnus was going to ask about Milner versus Hoare. I think they were if I may say, rivals and friends at the same time. So when Tony Hoare gave the speech for when he received the SIG-Plan Career Achievement Award, he was basically talking about the influence of many people that he considered his friends and his rivals. And I'm sure he didn't mention names, but I'm sure that Robin Milner was one of those. So they were looking at basically the same object of study, namely the concurrent process, using very similar lines of thought, but from slightly different viewpoints. So the approach was more operational somehow, grounded in the executional process on Milner's side, whereas Hoare's approach was sort of more abstract, more initially at least grounded on sort of denotational semantics, which was sort of the Oxford approach of doing things from the days of stages, and so on. Moreover, sort of Milner's approach was what today we would call a branching time approach, where you view the executions of a process in terms of the tree of computations that describes the possibly non-deterministic execution of a process. In Hoare's original work, the approach was most based on sort of single linear executions. But these are details in a way, so the basic ideas were essentially the same, but worked out with different styles and with different results. And both of them actually emphasize very much the development of tools to support the analysis of such processes. Okay, so if there are no further questions, thank you again for listening. And I'm supposed to remind you that there is a master's thesis defense in M1 of 2 started in 3 minutes now.